Okay, I think we can go. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see you, and thank you for joining our virtual roundtable on missing middle housing, a proven strategy for affordability and walkable neighborhoods, sponsored by Metta. I'm Roger Dickinson, and I am the policy director for Civic, formerly the local government commission. We've got a truly exciting program this afternoon. Before we get to that, just a couple of housekeeping items. If you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be taking note of those questions. And when we get to the questions and answers, then we'll have a chance to have the panelists respond to the questions. If you have a question that one of them may be able to quickly answer just by responding in writing, that may be something they also choose to do along the way. Please bear in mind that it's not really feasible for us to discuss specific circumstances in specific jurisdictions in order to keep it of interest to everyone. We want to try to maintain a more general level with the questions, but we certainly encourage your questions, and you may have something you describe that not only fits your circumstances, but that of others who are listening in this afternoon. So we appreciate you again being here, and I'm very excited to be able to introduce our three outstanding presenters this afternoon. We're talking about a subject that in some ways embodies an old saying that it's an idea whose time has come and gone and come again. When we think about the way communities and neighborhoods were built and structured in the early 1900s and how we moved away from that, we're coming back to a lot of those ideas in current times. So missing middle is something that fits that paradigm, and the three presenters we have today are certainly well-versed in this subject and have a lot to share. First of all, and we're going to proceed in this order, I'm going to introduce all three at once, so we are more expeditious in transitions from one to the next. And we're lucky enough today to have Karen Parolek, who is a principal and CFO of Opticos Design. She's a national expert in zoning reform and form-based codes. And Karen's efforts have helped revolutionize the way we regulate land development in our communities to reinforce more walkable, rollable, and sustainable places. Next, we're going to hear from David Garcia. David is the policy director for the Terner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley. Go Bears. And he leads the center's engagement in local, state, and federal housing policy and supports the generation of research-driven policy ideas, proposals, and papers. And third, we get to hear from Mott Smith, who is the co-founder and principal of Civic Enterprise. He's also a founding board member of the California Infill Builders Association and is an adjunct faculty member in USC's Master of Real Estate Development program. So he can really give us an on-the-street view of this topic. So once again, our thanks for joining us. We hope you will find this as interesting as we believe it is, and topical. And with that, Karen, I am going to turn the virtual microphone over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Roger, and thank you to Civic and to Metta for hosting us today in this conversation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, Roger, can you confirm that you can see my full slide on the screen?
I can see your full slide, Karen.
Okay, great. All right, thanks so much.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll get started with talking about, there are lots of different ways that people like to live in the United States. So a couple of stories that I like to tell are that my son's middle school teacher I live in a walkable neighborhood in Berkeley, and I am able to walk my kids to school or ride bikes. I ride my bike to work. I drive occasionally. It's a really wonderful neighborhood to raise my kids. And my son's middle school teacher, my son's kindergarten teacher, lives within walking distance of both us and the elementary school. And she lives in a building that looks like a single family home. It fits into our low rise, tree lined, single family neighborhood look and feel. But there's actually 3 units in it. And one unit, she lives with her husband and their 2 young children. And she is my son's kindergarten teacher. Her husband is actually my daughter's middle school PE teacher. So 2 public school teachers and their 2 kids. In the second unit lives her brother and his wife and their 2 children. And in the third unit lives her mother and father. So 3 generations living in what looks like a single family home, each having their own spaces. And her mother is actually also a kindergarten teacher at my son's elementary school. So 3 public school teachers housed within walking distance of their work in one of the most expensive markets in the country. And these types of housing choices that enable people of different household sizes, different types to have choices in how they live and where they live, and to be able to house more people within walkable neighborhoods is what we're here to talk about today. So what's the problem? Why is this so important to discuss? Well, if you're here, you know what some of the problems are, but I'm going to go through them because there's actually many. The household demographics across our country are changing. 30% of households are single people. By 2025, it's estimated that 75% or more of households will not have any children in them. And if you think about what the product of a detached single family home was designed for, it was designed for this stereotypical family in the background. 2 parents, 2.2 kids and a dog in the backyard. That needed a big yard wanted a big yard for the kids to run around and the dog to run around in. But if that product was designed for households with children and 75% households will not have children, there's different needs and different interests. By 2023, 1 in 5 Americans will be 65 or older. And the idea of how do we age and stay in our communities, well, maybe we don't want to take care of a big house or a big yard anymore. And our increasingly multicultural society is leading to more interest in multi-generational living. There's just this desire for more housing choice. When you think about the housing products that have been designed over the past 75 years, it's basically these 3 types: detached single family homes, townhouses, or apartments and flats. So 3 products for this incredible diversity of households in our country. Also, there's an increased desire for walkable neighborhood living. People, young and old, 60% of people are now favoring walkable mix of houses and stores within walking distance of their homes. And that's both the millennial generation and the baby boomers. AARP is one of our largest supporters of missing middle housing, as baby boomers are looking to live in walkable neighborhoods to be able to walk to shops or walk to theater post, as we recover from the pandemic. But when cities and developers hear that this increase for walkable neighborhood living is happening, and they think about how to build that, too many people are looking at these images on the left, and they're thinking about city living, and that it's saying people want city living. And some do, and it's a wonderful place to live for some people. But many more people are actually talking about neighborhood living. These pictures on the right, where these are low rise, 2, maybe 2.5 story buildings, tree lined streets, walkable neighborhood living. And so that's what we're going to talk about more today. As you all know, the affordable housing crisis is rapidly growing. In 2017, already 31% of households were housing cost burdened, and that has gone up since the pandemic. And again, when we talk about affordable housing, there are some people that are claiming that in order to have affordable housing, given the size of the problem, that we need to subsidize housing. And that's absolutely true. We absolutely need to subsidize. We're never going to get market rate housing that can meet the needs of households at the lowest incomes. And other people are saying it's a supply and demand issue. We need to increase supply, and because the issue is we just haven't built enough housing. And that's true too. We do need to increase supply. But when you look at what's being built as subsidized affordable housing and what's being built as market rate housing, physically, they look the same. They look like these, 4 and 5 story mid-rise apartment buildings, and there are other solutions. And then if you look at the people that are building detached single family homes, it is no longer possible to deliver a detached single family home at a price that's attainable by middle income households in most of the country. It's just not possible. So Yet the majority of our towns across the country are zoned only for detached single-family housing. These are some maps from a group called Desegregate Connecticut. And on the left is the state of Connecticut. Everywhere where you see purple is where a detached single-family home is allowed to be built in the state of Connecticut. And then the map on the right, all those tiny little dots of purple are the places where you can build a fourplex. So the vast majority of our land in the country, and this is true state after state across California and most towns, the vast majority, sometimes often over 75% of our land is zoned only for detached single family housing, but we can no longer build that housing at a price that most households can afford. And then it also affects the fact that these detached single family zones were part of our racial history. A lot of the reason that towns in our country were zoned for detached single family was because it prevented Black and brown people from being able to move into those neighborhoods because they could not get mortgages. So this is the part of our history of our country that we also need to look at. And it's a racial equity issue around opening up some of that single family zoning. And finally, the reality is that the current patterns of development are environmentally and economically unsustainable. So from an environmental standpoint, the travel emissions from people living in spread out locations where they have to drive everywhere they go is no longer sustainable. And we have to start building in more compact ways, both to make our transportation emissions go down, but also to preserve our land for agricultural uses and for open space uses. We need to stop raising our land and preserve our land for those uses and for ranching. And then it's economically unsustainable. The reality is, if you look at the infrastructure that's required to support these, 20 houses on this slide, the length of road that has to be built and maintained, the length of water and sewer that has to be built to maintain. School busing, having busing out to these far distances for our kids, fire services, getting fire trucks to serve these large areas of land. This infrastructure is very expensive when we spread out the way that we develop. And so developing more compactly is a fiscally responsible way to develop land so that our cities can actually afford to build and maintain the infrastructure. And as we're nearing the tipping point of 75 years since the major infrastructure boom in the 40s, 1930s and 40s and 50s in this country, that infrastructure is coming to the end of its lifespan and is needing to be replaced. And so some cities are actually going bankrupt over the cost of replacing their infrastructure. It is a major issue, and we need to look at differently how we can afford to maintain and replace our infrastructure. So those are all of the different issues that we're going to talk about, some solutions today. So missing middle housing, as I mentioned before, most of what's getting built for the past 75 years on the left-hand side, detached single-family homes, and on the right-hand side, mid-rise and high-rise apartment buildings. But if you look at our historic towns, every town in this country built before the 1940s, there are all of these other building types, wonderful building types, duplexes and triplexes, bungalow courts, small multiplexes. These existed in all of our historic neighborhoods before we started zoning them single family only. And so we call these types missing middle housing. And it's really quite simple. These are house scale buildings, and that scale and form factor is really important. I'll talk about that soon, but they're house scale buildings that happen to have multiple units in them in walkable neighborhoods. So I'll give you some examples. Duplexes, side-by-side duplexes, so 2 units side by side, stacked 2 units, one on top of the other, stacked duplex. Cottage court. This is my favorite type. So these are small, usually 1-story little bungalows arranged around a shared court. And when my kids were younger, I used to dream that I lived in one of these little cottages, and I had babysitters living across the cottage, across the court, and the other ones. But as our families are living, our nuclear families are living apart from larger families, having a support system. This is a great support network. I've also talked with my girlfriends about moving into one of these as we retire, and potentially having a shared caregiver who lives in the 5th unit in the back. So lots of possibilities. Fourplexes, again, the size of a detached single family home, but with 4 units on it. And this building on the left, the one in the red brick, is a really important example. This one's in Dallas, Texas. And easily in Dallas or in many places, this building could easily be a detached single family home. This particular building has 4 units in it, so it's a fourplex. And over on the left-hand side, you can just see a tiny little bit of yellow brick in the background. And that building next to it looks exactly the same as this one, except that it's yellow brick. That's the only difference. And that one actually has 8 units in it. So again, the same size building, It can house one family, it can house 4 families, or it can house 8 families. So that's what we're talking about. Live work units. These are units where the building from top to bottom is one owner. The ground floor space is a flex space. So the upper floors are residential, it's where the home is. And the ground floor space can also be a large living room or a game room or someplace the family lives, or it can be a retail or a business space. So in the one on the left, the developer of this town actually has his real estate office on the ground floor. So lots of flexibility there. Small multiplexes, and we usually talk about these in the range of 6 to 10 to 12 units. They can certainly go up to 20 units. We've seen some lovely 2-story multiplexes, but usually we talk about them in the range of kind of 8 to 12. And courtyard apartments, and these are a single building that creates it's a U shape, so creates a courtyard in the center of them. So we have these examples all across the United States. So here's some examples in Detroit, Michigan. You can see the stacked duplexes and a small multiplex. In Denver, Colorado. These are some examples in Sacramento. Some examples in Atlanta, Georgia. And what you'll find is the types exist across the country. The features of the architecture will vary because they were built, again, this was before air conditioning was invented, so they were built to address climatic concerns, or cultural interests also, but the types all exist across the board. And they fit into neighborhoods of all sizes. I was giving this presentation in the state of New Hampshire recently and was looking at some examples in New Hampshire. And you'll look at this, the one right in the middle, this is a triplex in a town that only has 314 people in it. Right. So, and on the left, the 5-plex in a town that has 4,800 people in it. So these are towns of all sizes. Historically, these have been a part of what makes American towns work. And the trick is that, again, they look like a detached single-family home. Most people, and I have been on walks with professional planners who would tell me that a neighborhood was all detached single-family homes, and I had to point out to them that no, they weren't. Because you often have to go look at the mailboxes, or you go look at the utility boxes to be able to tell, or maybe the front on the right-hand side, you can see there's one front door in the front, and then behind that, there's actually 2 front doors, right? So you have to look for these details. And once you learn how to look for them, it becomes a game. You'll be walking around all the time and you'll just be, hey, wait, look, that's actually a 4-plex there. And we knew how to deliver these historically. These were so common in the United States that you could buy them in the Sears catalog. They just are part of our history, and were always very common and very accessible and very available to everyone. I wish they still cost this price. That would be nice. So I do want to mention that these are that we can talk about middle housing in 2 different ways. And this is really important as you're talking in your community about what you're looking for. So what we call missing middle housing is a middle form and scale. It's talking about the form and the scale of the building. These are low-rise buildings, again, that look like detached single-family homes. They're usually 2.5 stories, occasionally 3, just like a single-family home. But they have multiple units in it. And this is important because what we're talking about is how can we house more people within our existing single-family neighborhoods? And how can we make those neighborhoods work better environmentally, work better fiscally, work better to house more people? You can also have middle housing for households with middle incomes. And how are we housing people in middle incomes? Missing middle housing is one solution for that. Missing middle housing can help deliver housing for middle income households. However, mid-rise and high-rise apartment buildings can also deliver housing for middle income households. And so we want to be really clear that when we talk about middle income housing, it can have a whole variety of form and scale. But when we talk about missing middle housing, we're specifically talking about these low-rise building types. So what are the important characteristics? They are, as I've said many times, compatible with single-family homes. If you take home one message from this, it is that they fit into single-family neighborhoods. That is the idea here. So again, it looks like a house, but it has multiple units in it. It's a triplex. The units are smaller, and that's part of the beauty of it. You're providing units sometimes below 1,000 square feet. We've designed them anywhere from 750 to 1,500 square foot units. They can vary, so they can go smaller. This is about providing housing choice. So not everyone needs a larger detached single family home. Many people are looking for smaller living. It can also help with the affordability aspect. And think about, how many 1,000 square foot units actually exist in your town right now. There's actually probably a gap and a need for them. They're located in livable communities. These are part of a walkable context. And this is part of, Gen Z, millennials, baby boomers are all asking for this type of housing where they can live closer to different amenities. And the way I like to describe it is they're trading the amenity of space. They're trading a large house and a large yard for the amenity of place, for having a neighborhood that they can walk and see their neighbors and the kids can walk to school, and have that walkable small town lifestyle. And as I mentioned earlier, this is really good governance. Building in more compact land patterns where we fit more housing within walking distance of shops. It supports our local businesses. It makes our infrastructure we're having more households to help pay for the infrastructure, so less infrastructure distance, but paid for by more households. And it's good for people's physical and emotional health, for social resilience. It's a really important tool for social resilience, and then for the environmental reasons that I mentioned earlier. It does include providing fewer off-street parking spaces. So part of the puzzle of how we make the financial puzzle of small towns work is that we are having more households within walk distance. And so they can choose to pay for fewer cars. It's part of the affordability aspect. A family might have only one car rather than two. My family of four has lived with one car our entire life of our children for the past 20 years. Some people are choosing to not have cars at all. It supports better services within walking distance, so it supports your local businesses. And so part of the puzzle is you're using the land more for housing than for parking. You're rebalancing that balance. Right now, we require a lot of parking, and that means that houses are more spread out, which makes it really difficult to get enough houses within walking distance of small local businesses. So we're trading back some of that parking to put more housing on, and that means that people don't need the parking as much, and it also means that there's more people to support the local businesses and to help pay for infrastructure. This supports a strong sense of community. People across the country are excited and building this because they're looking for more community. People are striving for connection, and these types are a great way to do that. And lastly, it can be affordable by design. It's part of the solution of providing affordable by design market rate housing. And so again, as we look at the barbell of affordable housing that I showed partly earlier, there's this solution in the middle of missing middle housing, and it's more affordable by design because the land costs per unit are lower. So if you have one lot, and instead of building one family home on it, you're housing four families, those four families are now splitting the cost of that one piece of land 4 ways. So you've lowered your land costs. It's lower construction costs than mid-rise buildings. It doesn't require a concrete podium, and this is all wood-built, stick-built construction. The units are smaller, and so you're paying for less square footage. And that's actually a win-win. I'll talk about later for developers. They're actually paying, the people who are living there are paying less per square foot, but the developers are actually able to charge more per square foot than single family homes. So it's actually a win-win there. And then it also helps with attainability because households that live in these walkable neighborhoods and these types can have lower transportation costs. And it's a great way to support small local builder businesses to increase local incremental development. Oh, and I guess I had slides about all of this. So basically, it's affordability by design. We're not talking about capital A subsidized housing. We're talking about attainable price points. It depends on where you are in your town or your region. And here in California, again, it depends on the town and the region, but it can be sometimes as much as reach households at 60% AMI, sometimes up to 120, 150% AMI. But it is more affordable than typical market rate detached single family homes. And it's by building more units on the same lot. I forgot I included these slides. I explained this all before, and the reduced cost of transportation. The annual cost of owning a car is $10,000, and the parking costs the average renter $225 a month. So if they can even go down from 2 cars to 1 car, that saves them a lot of money. And we're looking at everything. And so This was a study done by the Brookings Institute, and they looked at a lot in the Washington, D.C. area, and they could build a new single family home, and they'd have to sell it for $1 million. They could build 3 townhouses, and they'd sell it for each townhouse for essentially $1 million. But they could build a 6-plex and sell them for under $600,000. So again, this is not going to hit the lowest income households, but it is much more attainable than building townhomes or single family homes on these properties. So it's helping provide both supply, but also providing housing options and at a lower price point. And I like to remind people that doesn't have to look like a big box. It can actually look like this, if it's designed well, it can actually look like these detached single family homes. And as I mentioned earlier, AARP is one of the biggest proponents of missing middle housing as a way to age in place in communities. And this is a report that was just released about a week ago that we helped AARP develop. It's available for download. So how does it fit in the neighborhood? As I've mentioned, it just fits in with the detached single family homes. The houses here that are in white are detached single family homes, and the houses that are in yellow are the missing middle housing, and they fit right in. You often can't even tell the difference. They're also a great solution for secondary corridors. So maybe you have a corridor in your town, your primary corridors are thriving, or might have stronger commercial prospects, but especially now with the shift in work from home, you might have secondary corridors that you're not really going to be able to get the commercial uses that are needed. So having missing middle housing along these secondary corridors can be a great solution. And especially with the new state law that was just passed about using commercial land for housing, this is a great solution on secondary corridors. It also works really well as a transition building types from higher intensity corridors. So this drawing is a little bit hard to see, but on the top right corner is a primary corridor where mid-rise housing has been built on that corridor. This is a drawing that we did in Austin, Texas. And in the foreground, the street in the foreground is like 1 block back from that corridor. And then there's an alley through the middle of the block. And so basically by putting the mid-rise housing along the primary corridor, stepping it down toward the alley, having an alley, and then you can use these missing middle types. Sometimes the kind of multiplexes, the 6 and 8 and 12 unit buildings work best to transition from those mid-rise buildings down into the lower rise detached single family neighborhoods. So it's a great transition strategy. And the same thing happens for redevelopment sites. So an old strip mall or an old mall that you might be looking at redeveloping with mid-rise housing, you can transition into the neighborhoods with these missing middle types. So why haven't we been building it? Well, it's been illegal in zoning for the past 75 years in most towns. So the zoning barriers, the financing models don't exist. Neighborhoods are worried when they hear people talk about more density, talk about multifamily housing, talk about upzoning. Neighbors are worried about what's going to happen in their towns. And that's why we came up with this concept of missing middle housing, to show how it can actually really enhance and help towns and be wonderful places. The markets are still untested, and getting these built at efficient scales are all challenges, but we're tackling all of them. We'll talk about more of that today. The regulations are really ineffective. So when you are able to build more than 1 unit, this is what people think of when they hear multifamily or apartments, because this is what has been built in the past. And so we have to fix our zoning to actually make sure that what gets built is more appropriate and more beloved by the community. And so this is a study that we did in Novato, California, where we took a lot and we showed this was what is allowed by their current zoning, a 35-foot tall detached single family home. Their general plan was in the process of being updated. And so their general plan did allow 3 units, but because of the requirements in it, this is what the parking requirements in particular, this is what was likely to get built. But what was not allowed was 4 units with less parking placed up near the street, right? So this is actually much more compatible with the neighborhood, but was not allowed by the general plan or zoning. So this is what we're trying to get at, is like, you have to pay attention to the form and the scale of the buildings when you do the zoning to make sure that what's built is more compatible. And if you do that, you can actually provide really wonderful housing. So as was mentioned earlier, I co-wrote this book on zoning reform back in 2008 on how how we write zoning. We started writing zoning as part of proliferating detached single family zoning across our country, and we were zoning for separation and segregation. That's how zoning was invented, was to separate and segregate us. And so a small group of practitioners looked at how do we actually write zoning to create walkable neighborhoods, and form-based codes are the solution that we came up with. And so making sure that you're looking at how to get your zoning right is really important. There are whole presentations about that, so I'm going to leave it at that, but there's plenty of information. And I'll leave with some examples of how developers are responding. This is a neighborhood that we've designed outside of Omaha, Nebraska. The entire neighborhood is missing middle housing. It's really a wonderful place and really a success for both the residents there and the developers. There's a whole variety of housing types all in the same neighborhood, and there's a 3 times price difference. So income diversity is really important. And the lowest priced unit and the highest priced unit are 3 times difference. And so they're able to have quite a wide variety of income levels in their town, in this new town. The Muse homes, these are some homes that we designed in Salt Lake City. And at this point, this was 8 years ago, and the developer couldn't offer a townhouse or a detached single family home at the time for under $200,000, but they really wanted to offer something. And so we designed these units that did come in under $200,000. So the number 1 buyer of these units were professional single women who were looking for a lower price point, a smaller unit, but safety and community. So they were able to offer something for under $200,000, and the developer was able to get the second highest price per square foot of anything developed in the entire region, higher than some of the detached single family homes. So it really was a win-win for both buyers and developers. And this is a community that we're designing in Tempe, Arizona. This is actually going to be a car-free community. And so the developer has decided it's right across the street from a light rail station. The developer has decided that there's enough interest in people who are actually looking to live car-free, but still live in a neighborhood, not in a big city. And so they've designed this, we've designed this project for them, and it's coming out of the ground. It's being built right now. They have a 3,000 person waiting list. People are moving in from all over the country to be able to live here. And this is a great example. On the left is what was previously entitled on the site with all of the parking that they were including. This was $28 million in parking costs alone for that entitled project. On the right-hand side is the project that we've designed. And you can see there's almost the same number of units, 636 units rather than 696, but by losing all of the parking, we were able to lower the scale down to a walkable neighborhood scale. And then lastly, affordable developers are actually looking at using missing middle housing. This is an old elementary school site in California, in Pescadero, that they're looking to redevelop the school site, and they're using a mix of subsidized housing and also missing middle housing. And the missing middle housing at market rate is going to be able to actually even help subsidize the subsidized units. So they are expected to sell well enough that they're going to actually help subsidize the other housing on the site. So where do we get started? There's a lot that you have to tackle if you're looking at providing missing middle in your town. We at Opticos have developed some offerings of how to take a look at doing a missing middle housing scan of your neighborhood to look at where in your town it would make sense to build missing middle housing and what are the barriers that exist. And then we have a deep dive that actually does some testing, like I showed you, the lot testing, and provides some zoning updates that you can, solutions that you can provide. So this is an example of looking at, where in the town it makes sense to build it. What are some of the different barriers to the different types, and what are the barriers in the zoning? This is one we did in Greenville, South Carolina. And then we graphically test the code again, like I showed you, for what makes sense. So wrapping up, I want to tell a quick story before I pass this over to David. This house is the house where Michelle Obama grew up. It is in Chicago, and it is a duplex. It's a stacked duplex. There's one unit on the ground floor and one unit on the upper floor. And people talk about the American dream being living in a detached single family home with a big yard. But in reality, that was sold to us as single family zoning was proliferating, and the federal government was subsidizing single family homes. In reality, the American dream is immigrants moving to this country and having a chance to live free of religious persecution and other types of persecution And first generation immigrant families, the children of immigrants often used these types in order to get a foothold in the real estate market. And so they would build a house and they would they would build a second unit on the house to be able to rent to family or to rent to have income. And so that's exactly what happened. Michelle's aunt owned this house and she lived on the ground floor, and her parents rented the second floor where she and her brother grew up and were raised. Then when her aunt passed away, her parents either inherited or bought the house, I'm not sure. And then when she graduated from college and she and Barack Obama got married, they lived in a second unit. So this one duplex provided ways for 3 different generations to live at different points in their life, to have affordability, to have income, and to live in a wonderful neighborhood. So that's the type of housing choices that we're talking about. It helps do all of these things, provide housing choices. It helps lower housing costs. It helps address historic segregation and the racial wealth gap. It helps address climate change and protecting our farmland and our ranch land and our open space. And it helps strengthen the community's economy and lower infrastructure costs per household. Does a lot of work, these little buildings. But mostly it's about providing housing choices to people, providing opportunities to live in our towns and to live humanely. And it's really about creating homes and neighborhoods that people love. So I will wrap there. Pass it over to David.
Well, thank you, Karen. As we transition to David, just a reminder to those of you viewing, if you have a question, be sure to stick it in the Q&A so we can hopefully get to it when we have that portion of the program. And David, take it away.
Thank you very much, Roger. And I'm going to go ahead and share my slides screen. It's always really wonderful to have a panel with Karen, but it's also really difficult to follow her because as an architect, she has all of these beautiful pictures and illustrations that so perfectly articulate what we're talking about here. And then I'm the data guy, and I'm going to have just a bunch of charts and numbers. So I'm glad we got that out of the way. So you're all still awake for that piece. But real quick, again, I'm David Garcia. I'm Policy Director at the Terner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley. We are a housing research and policy organization at Berkeley that focuses on issues of housing access and supply. But today I'm going to walk through some of our recent work and observations around missing middle. We have a paper coming out hopefully relatively soon that walks through a lot of the opportunities and challenges for missing middle housing in California and nationwide. So to start, Karen did such a great job articulating what missing middle housing is. I think we no need to go through that again. But I'll just note a couple quick things here. One of the reasons we are really interested in exploring this specific development typology is that it is really absent from the majority of our zoned land throughout the country, in that it's not allowed anymore, as Karen already walked through. But a lot of cities are reversing course and intentionally creating zones and plans that would allow for missing middle housing typologies to be reintroduced in places like single family neighborhoods. We have seen this in the state of Oregon. They have statewide legislation that essentially requires at least 2 and sometimes up to 3 units per parcel throughout the state. And we've also seen this in Minneapolis, which was the first major city to allow for additional units on single family parcels citywide. In California, we've obviously seen some policy movement here through recent changes in accessory dwelling unit law, but also recently with the passage of Senate Bill 9 and also Senate Bill 10. So clearly this is something that is not going away. In addition to the places I just mentioned, we've seen missing middle housing legislation introduced in places as disparate as Nebraska, cities in Florida, the state of Maine. So this is really a national trend towards reintroducing missing middle housing into neighborhoods. What are the benefits? Karen talked a lot about this. Just to reiterate some of her points, we have a lot of evidence that missing middle housing can be provided at attainable prices. I really appreciated Karen's emphasis there on attainable. So not deed restricted affordable necessarily, but provided at more affordable price points to a broader swath of the population, many times middle-income households. When San Jose was considering a similar change to their single-family zones, their opportunity housing program, a city analysis found that allowing up to 4 to 6 units per parcel would be affordable to middle-income households. And if they were to even increase the allowable homes up to, say, 8 to 10 units, the affordability benefits reach even deeper into area median incomes. And we've seen some research out of the Pacific Northwest that shows that missing middle housing can be offered at relatively cheaper prices than comparable single family homes. So we also did some work earlier this year that looks at middle income housing production throughout the state. And we found that the cities that were doing better with middle income housing production were those that really intentionally zoned for smaller projects. So maybe not necessarily the duplexes or triplexes, but things like smaller lot, single family homes that can be offered again at lower price points. Also, one of the really important benefits are the ability to provide more housing in a way that fits into our existing neighborhoods and provides clear greenhouse gas emission benefits, lower vehicle miles traveled. All of these things align with the state's stated environmental goals. And then Karen really put a fine point on this too. You know, we have in some places 80–90% of our housing or neighborhoods are exclusively single family. And in many cases, this was done explicitly to keep poor people out of neighborhoods decades ago. And so reintroducing some of these housing types is, I think, important to acknowledge why we have so much land zoned for single family homes only in the first place. So I'm going to focus a little bit on what California has done to date. So I always like to start with accessory dwelling units, which is, I think, a typology a lot of folks in California are really familiar with. These are your backyard dwelling units that many times can house a family member, a caregiver, or just on the open market. And in 2016, the state passed the first in a series of laws that allow for more accessory dwelling unit development basically in every city throughout California. And what we've found that in those 6 years, ADU development has really taken off throughout the state. So from virtually nothing in 2016 to almost 20,000 ADUs permitted just this last year. ADUs make up about 20% of total new units in the state of California, which is a really significant, I think, success story when we talk about how legislation actually leads to on-the-ground production. The state has tried to build on that success through the passage of Senate Bill 9, which allows homeowners to split their lot and to build up to 2 new housing units on both of those lots. So it's ostensibly allowing 4 homes where today you can only build, or as of last year, could only build 1. But that law has not taken off yet. Based on all the conversations we've had with many planning departments, we've seen very, very little uptake of Senate Bill 9. I have a headline here from the Mercury News that kind of comes to the same conclusion. And so part of what we wanted to do with this research I'm about to walk through is understand what are those barriers to building projects through Senate Bill 9 or things like duplexes, triplexes, that missing middle housing typology. What do we need to do beyond changing the base zoning that the state has basically already done to make sure that these projects actually happen? So to do that, we convened a series of conversations with developers of missing middle housing, not just in California, but nationwide, to really understand the challenges they're running into, even in places that have liberalized their zoning, like Portland, like Minneapolis, like places in California. And from these conversations, we have a number of findings that I think are really important and have really good lessons for cities who are trying to think proactively about how to get this stuff actually built. So I'm going to walk through some of those findings quickly here. But what we heard overwhelmingly was that changing the zoning by itself is just not enough. there are so many other factors that dictate whether or not a project actually gets built, and cities need to recognize how many of those factors are in their control and think thoughtfully about how to reform them. So for example, design requirements oftentimes will limit the size of the structure that can be built on a single family parcel. So even if you're allowed to build up to 4 units, if I'm only allowed to build a 2,000 square foot structure or what have you, that could limit the utility of any zoning change, because maybe can't even fit those kinds of projects onto a lot. So the image you see here is from the city of Portland. They have something called the residential infill program that actually scales the size of the allowable homes up as more units are proposed to be built on a parcel. And so if I wanted to build one home, for example, I would be capped at 2,500 square feet. But as I propose 3 and 4 homes, the allowable buildable area increases as well. And so lets projects pencil better. So cities who are really intentional about doing more than the zoning changes are also thinking about these design requirements. We also heard that allowing things like duplexes and triplexes may not be enough to see significant uptake. We heard that particularly in high cost areas, it doesn't make sense financially to build just 1 or 2 extra units on a lot because the land costs a lot and construction costs are really high. And so you may need to, as a city thinking about cultivating missing middle housing, allow slightly more density for projects to really take hold. Things like 6 to 8 units were mentioned in our conversations about being really the sweet spot in many locations for getting projects to pencil out. There's also a lot of things that are very arcane and in the weeds, but have really important implications for the uptake of missing middle housing. This includes things on for subdivision laws, utility connection rules, things that maybe we don't think of as being kind of the really headline grabbing zoning requirements or changes, but really make a difference when a developer's trying to make a project work, when an architect's trying to design a project. So we also heard that the creation of missing middle housing presents a huge opportunity to scale up a new industry of builders who right now are doing things like home remodels, home additions, or accessory dwelling units. It's likely that those are the types of small businesses that are going to build this stuff. So it's not necessarily coming top down from large real estate development companies, but more from the homeowners themselves or small general contractors and subcontractors who are more likely to be local, and oftentimes more likely people of color as well. So opening up the zoning envelope for missing middle housing is a really key component to creating this ground up industry that can support local economies as well. We also heard that a clear and efficient approval process is really important to making this stuff work too. The places where you see the most missing middle development, they've really been empowered by, the staff has really been empowered by elected officials and other professionals who are pushing them to find ways to get projects to work and include things like, having pre-approved plans that can make the development process much smoother, streamlined approval processes, permitting, things like that. We also heard that financing for these projects can be an interesting mix and very different from traditional real estate financing. Traditionally, if a developer wants to build a 100-unit apartment building, they would go to a big bank for a loan for their debt, and then they would also need to have an equity investor, so something like an equity private equity company or a pension fund or something like that. That's not quite the same model for building small scale stuff. What we heard overwhelmingly was that missing middle housing with what's being built today is actually financed more by local banks, CDFIs, and equities provided more by local individuals who have investment dollars who are committed to seeing this stuff built in their communities and understand the implications for seeing that happen. So on one hand, it's kind of heartening to see that it's a bit of a different financial calculation for missing middle housing. On the other hand, that's a hard model to scale, right? You can't really just go to every wealthy person in town and ask them to give you equity to build missing middle. So there is a need to look at financing structures and how to scale that if we really want to see these kinds of projects take off. So the last thing I'll talk about is really what we should do from here. We've heard a lot about how some cities have kind of done somewhat outlandish things to try and get out of state requirements, like Senate Bill 9, for example, the city of Woodside declaring the entire town a refuge for mountain lions, or cities using historic preservation to skirt the applicability of Senate Bill 9. But again, what most cities are doing is probably not intentional, and there's a lot less head grabbing when it comes to impeding the progress of the development of missing middle housing. Again, things like design requirements, impact fees, parking, all of these things they don't make news, but they actually are really important when it comes to figuring out how to make this stuff work. So creating statewide standards for missing middle is really important. We saw this with ADUs. They really didn't take off until subsequent legislation was passed to make sure that cities were not imposing overly burdensome requirements on ADU development. So we should expect to see the same thing for things like Senate Bill 9 projects in subsequent legislative sessions. But cities who are thinking proactively about wanting to do this stuff today, they don't need to wait for the state to give them those tools. They can do that right now. They can think about how their FARs or floor area ratios or their parking ratios and things like that can be changed so that these projects can have a better chance of penciling out. And process improvements are important to this as well. It's not all about just changing the base zoning again. Creating a dedicated staff to review missing middle projects, project plans, creating just the ecosystem where missing middle projects can succeed from process permitting perspective is really key too. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop there. We have someone who actually builds this stuff coming up next in Mott, and so I'm excited to hear what he has to say. And also thanks to Mott, because he was part of our conversations that led to some of this research. So thanks, Mott, and thanks again, Roger, for convening this conversation.
Well, thank you, David, and you've teed it up perfectly for Mott. So without delay, we will go right to you, Mott.
I appreciate that, and per what David said, the only thing harder than following Karen is following Karen and David. So thanks, guys, for putting me in that spot. Happy to do it though. All right, my first slide, unfortunately, is a dad joke, and I'm just going to let you guys think about this for a minute here, and then I'm going to move on. There's a great paper which influenced my thinking a lot about missing middle. That was by Brian on Raphael Bostic, who at the time was at USC and the Atlanta Fed, now mostly the Atlanta Fed. A couple of other authors, including Anthony Orlando, who's now at Cal Poly Pomona, who was sort of the primary researcher on this, about what they were calling small, medium, multifamily properties around the country. And they studied the importance of projects of less than 50 units to the housing stock. And just cutting right to the chase here, buildings of less than 50 units, but more than one, are actually 20% of the U.S. housing stock. And
Mott, just not to
Yes,
interrupt you, can you make your slide full screen?
that is a lovely idea. Let me see if I can do that. How's that?
Okay, I think you got it.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Roger. Anyway, hugely important part of the housing stock. I mean, this includes single family homes in the overall denominator. So very significant. Interestingly, looking at where some of the smaller missing middle projects are right now, 2 to 4 unit structures, we can see there's a heavy concentration in the older parts of the US, the Northeast, and basically the urban Midwest around Chicago. So places where where density was first born in this country. I'm going to quickly run through a ton of slides showing a missing middle project that my company did. This was a project called the Molten Bungalows. It reminds me of a couple of the slides that Karen showed. This was the original building permit for the project when it was first constructed back in 1926. And this was the guy on the bottom is the person that we actually bought the project from, Harold Weishaupt. Fortunately, he was an adult when we bought it, and We weren't taking advantage of a child. At the time, this was housing that people just showing up in Los Angeles, whether they were writers or studio workers or wannabe actors or whatever they were, could come for an extended stay. They didn't have to bring any of their own furniture. As you can see, these are the things that came with the units: 6 china cups, 1 broom, 2 mops, wet and dry, etc. So it was a very kind of agile way to provide long-term housing for people. This is what the project looked like when we bought it. It was rental housing in the Silver Lake neighborhood, and we bought it back in 2005. This is a little while ago. This is what it looked like on the ground when we bought it. Not in good shape, had not been maintained. Typical units. There were technically 2 parking spaces per unit, but not anywhere near what code requires now. This was one of the nicer bathrooms on the property. And we went in and did what's called a small lot subdivision, where we converted this into, we improved all the units, did a historic preservation project, and subdivided it into 17 single-family parcels, tiny single-family parcels of less than 2,000 square feet apiece. As you can see here, we actually had to rebuild the garages with structural separations between them. We matched the original stucco, restored the built-ins, and again created what at the time was the most attainable single-family turnkey homes in the Silver Lake neighborhood of LA. We were also able to keep 3 of the original tenant households there as buyers, which is something we're really proud of, and they still invite us to their annual barbecues. And so just moving through really, really quickly here, what they look like when we were done. Okay, so my job is to talk a little bit about a developer's perspective on this, and David touched on this as well as Karen, but I wanted to get to 3 big barriers to producing missing middle housing from my perspective, again, as a developer. And I've divided these into 3 areas: zoning, building code, and the approvals process. And you'll notice that financing is not on this list, and that's really important. And I'll get to this in just a second. But when I started out in the development industry more than 20 years ago, whenever I brought up the sorts of projects I wanted to build, which were typically missing middle housing or mixed use projects, I heard the same thing, actually, usually from regulators. I heard that they had heard that financing wasn't available for these sorts of projects, and I shouldn't even try. And one of my mentors at the time was a great guy. I brought this up to him, and he said that's crazy, because if you've got a good project, you'll find money for it. And what he didn't tell me is you will tear your hair out and nearly die every time you start a new project looking for money. But it turned out that he was right, that when you've got a good project, you will find money. And so we shouldn't believe the myths that financing isn't available. But anyway, back to these. The three big barriers that I perceive are zoning, building code, and the approvals process. On the zoning side, parking requirements, as both Karen and David touched on, are by far the biggest issue. And the way these play out is there's an efficient size of a parking facility that you can build. And people, when you talk to economic, the economic analysts that cities will often hire to look at various policies, you'll often see spreadsheets where they'll say something like, a parking space costs $30,000 a piece to build. But what they don't understand, and what every developer understands, is that when you're talking about particularly structured parking, you don't buy parking by the space. It's like pizza or eggs. You even though you can sell a slice of pizza, you can't cook a slice of pizza. You cook a whole pizza. And so where parking requirements really become a problem is when you end up with a mismatch between what zoning allows and what you can fit geometrically and physically on a site. So if zoning would allow, say, 40 units of housing on a particular site, and it would require 2 parking spaces per unit, so you're at 80 parking spaces. And the footprint of the building is such that when you build a single parking deck, a single level of structured parking, you can provide, call it 50 spaces. Then you're in a real dilemma. Do you build 2 parking decks, and 50 times 2 is 100 spaces, so you'd be building 20 more spaces than you need, and the cost of those spaces is, of course, a real issue. Or do you downsize the number of units you provide to match a reasonable amount of parking, let's say 1 level? And what almost every developer that I know does is they downsize the number of units they can build to match the parking. And in places where parking has been deregulated, what we see is much more that developers max out the zoning that's allowed. And this is good for housing production. It's good for affordability. It's good for everything. And I'm very encouraged by the fact that AB 2097 was signed into law. This is the Laura Friedman bill, which eliminates parking requirements for all uses within a half mile of transit. It covers a lot of urban California. It doesn't cover enough of the state, in my view, but it does cover a lot of it. That will help quite a bit. And I just want to show you numerically what happens when you eliminate parking requirements. Some of my colleagues from UCLA and I, even though my academic appointment is at USC, studied the San Diego density bonus program. They had an enhanced density bonus program around transit. And one of the things that they did was in 2019, they eliminated parking requirements within a half mile of transit, much as AB 2097 is going to do statewide. And what this chart doesn't show is that in that year, from 2019 to 2020, overall housing production, forget about affordable, forget about density bonus, overall housing production in San Diego increased by 24% in a period when statewide housing production actually declined. And then, as you can see, here, density bonus production, which is generally going to be projects that are slightly larger than missing middle projects, but still there's some missing middle in there, went up significantly. And the amount of affordable housing produced, this is the blue area here on the chart, went up by a factor of 6 when they eliminated parking requirements. And that was really the only major change that San Diego implemented. So you can see how influential parking is at a global level. Another big issue is building codes. And again, I know Karen touched on some of the building code issues in some general and some specific ways. There is a movement now happening in California, Egress Reform, or what's sometimes called single stair reform. And it addresses an issue that buildings of 36 feet and taller need 2 stairwells. They need 2 points of egress in California. And while this sounds like it is kind of, who should mind this, the difference between a building, the 2 examples on the left, a building where you have those 2 points of egress, and an alternative, if you look at the building on the right here, where you've got single points of egress, single staircases, you can double the inefficiency of a building by requiring 2 staircases. And particularly where we're talking about missing middle type projects, small code issues like this make a huge difference to the economic viability of a project for developers. And so I'm very hopeful that single stair reform, egress reform, makes it through in the next legislative session. Another giant issue is the time it takes to get projects permitted. And again, one of the underlying principles of all of this is that the larger the developer, the more expensive the units, the more they can tolerate in terms of regulatory complexity, the more they can tolerate in terms of code requirements, and the more they can tolerate in terms of waiting time. We did a little study of how long it took to permit projects in LA from the day they were entitled to the day that they were that the permit was issued. As you could see, for 4 years running, we're basically at a year or more for just to get building permits in the city of Los Angeles. And this is a major barrier. In jurisdictions like, say, Dallas, permits take a matter of weeks, not a matter of years. And the jurisdictions where permits are issued quickly, housing tends to be much more affordable. Another key innovation that some jurisdictions are putting in place to deal with issues like time to permits is known as self-certification. And this is a process where licensed architects and engineers are able to stamp their own plans up to a certain size project or up to a certain kind of project. And the theory behind this is that the licensed architects and engineers should know enough to comply with code. And at the end of the day, a lot of this comes down to what happens when a building inspector shows up at the property anyway. And I can tell you as a developer that the fact that I have stamped plans from the building department is of little consolation when a building inspector tells me to change how I built something. There's always a negotiation with the building inspector, and the cities that have started to implement self-certification kind of recognize that. And it's a great way to save staff time for the projects that really need it, and to save review time so developers aren't paying for it. We also did a little analysis in LA, at least, of how projects of various sizes are coming out, and one thing that this chart doesn't show as clearly as I wish it did is that larger projects, 100-unit plus projects, basically comprise a larger and larger share of the total production in the city. And projects, single family has stayed relatively robust, but over the past 5 years, projects between 2 and 50 units have not been nearly as large a share as they really could be in the city. And again, for various reasons, because of the city's because of a policy focus on density bonus and developer provided deed restricted units, I think there's a bias towards larger and larger projects. And it's easy to forget about how important the attainable housing that gets built at smaller scales is. So I'm going to leave you guys with a few key policy notions here. When setting your land use policies, jurisdictions often assume that every land buyer is a developer. And in infill areas in particular, there's rarely such a thing as land anymore. There are sites, but almost every site in many jurisdictions actually has some kind of a going concern on it, whether it's a strip mall or a car wash or a parking lot or whatever it is. And more and more developers are competing with owner users and investors to buy these properties. And when development regulations cause the amount that developers can pay for a property to go down because it's increased development costs, it's often not the case that land prices come down to match. It's often the case that land prices stay exactly where they are, but instead of developers buying the property, somebody who's not going to build something ends up buying the property. Similarly, when setting policies, there's usually a period when existing properties are kind of metabolized through the new regulations. So somebody who bought a property last year, not really sure what regulatory process they were going to follow to get something built. New regulations come into place, and now they've got new options. And I can tell you from examples like Los Angeles's transit-oriented communities program, a ton of the projects for the first couple of years have been existing owners finding a new pathway. So it's important to decide whether you want to help those projects and or new owners. Crucially, and I know David touched on this, not all developers are the same. There are developers who take Wall Street money and developers who take family money and developers who take no money at all. There are mom and pop local builders. There are national companies and international companies. There are patient people and impatient people, all kinds of different situations. And the rules will determine which of those populations get to build. And I can tell you that historically, up through, say, the late 60s, early 70s, mom and pop builders were a hugely important provider of housing, particularly missing middle housing in California. And more as the way we regulate development has shifted, it's biased, sort of selected for larger and larger, more and more corporate developers. And that's that point. I made this point earlier that financing is much less of an issue than people say it is. Economics is much more of the point. And to bottom line this, a development is economically feasible if I make more money off of it than I spend. If it's profitable, it's economically feasible. Financing just says how easy it is for me to get a loan or to get equity investors. And it is harder to find investors and lenders for certain kinds of projects. But what I have learned in my career is that if you have the economics, you can often find the financing. So focus on the economics rather than the financing. I do recommend that as we implement new policies to promote missing middle and other things, that we that we continue evaluating them at least 5 years after implementation, because you're going to want you're going to want to see how new acquisitions are influenced by the policy, as opposed to just watching how existing properties are metabolized through the new policy. And I want to leave you with this. You should take everything I say and everything every developer says with a grain of salt. This is a wonderful book by a guy named Timur Kuran, who writes about this phenomenon called preference falsification. And he writes about how easy it is for us all in tightly knit groups to start sort of repeating the same things, whether we actually believe them or not. And I have definitely found that developers in particular who have projects pending in various cities or who expect to have projects pending in various cities, the things that they say are highly influenced by their desire to survive, the next 2 years or 5 years or whatever it is. Unfortunately, I have no projects pending in any city in California, so you can take that for what it's worth. But I just want to put that out there as a general caveat. And I'll leave you with this picture of the Molten Bungalows, our missing middle project in Silver Lake. And I hope I didn't run too far over time.
Well, Mott, thanks. You certainly left us with a provocative ending, and we'll all have to get the book and read it. We have time for about 10 or so minutes for at least some of the questions. We've got lots of good questions. David, I did want to ask you whether there are some tools that you have available that might be helpful to those in jurisdictions or even in the private sector, but particularly jurisdictions to help them get through figuring out what kind of housing and where they can put it in their communities.
Yeah, so I will plug an upcoming project we have where we actually walk through, as Mott put it, the economics of small scale projects. So, and how market conditions and policy variables influence those economics to make projects work or not work. So you can understand how changing the parking ratio or the setbacks might make or break a project. And so that is a resource we are putting together. It actually builds off something we put together a few years ago. I'll put a link in the chat if anyone's interested, but yeah, that is coming out soon. But I think it's just really critical when thinking about facilitating missing middle that we do understand the nexus between the economics of the project and all of the various policies that are not always in the city's control either, right? You also have counties, utility agencies that have jurisdiction over these projects, and they're not always talking to each other. So it takes a real concerted, thoughtful effort to bring all those folks into a room and figure out what needs to be smoothed out for projects to move forward successfully. So, but yeah, I'm happy to drop a link in the chat for that work and be on the lookout for that in the next couple months.
Great, thanks. We had a couple, three questions at least on how do you balance home ownership with producing missing middle projects such as you showed, Karen, or all three of you actually. And so since there's a real desire to develop and sustain home ownership in California, which is lower here than I think just about anywhere in the country. How do you see that working in the context of the kinds of projects you're talking about? And maybe Karen, you could start with that one.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, homeownership is a huge issue. We certainly are working toward missing middle housing contributing to it becoming the new starter home. There was actually an article in the New York Times just recently. Emily Badger wrote an article when we've talked about it for a long time as missing middle housing as the new starter home. Typically for it to become home ownership, there's two models, right? You either do, like I was talking about with the original immigrant story, you buy a place and you rent units. So you become essentially a small mom and pop landlord. And that's certainly a model. And I think we need to look at some of the financing mechanisms for when you qualify for a fourplex. Or even a duplex, and being able to use your income to qualify for more of a commercial loan rather than needing a residential loan and having to have enough income to be able to pay for a fourplex. So I think looking at that model and what's necessary to get the funding for an individual household to buy, or own a duplex or fourplex. The second model is essentially requires condoizing the building to be able to sell the units, or some other model. Big cities like San Francisco and New York City have other models like co-op type model, shared ownership in buildings. So other cities can start to look at those different possibilities of shared ownership or condoizing a building. And I think we really need to think about the construction defects law's impact on this. And I know there's real political headwinds against changing that law, but thinking about other ways to mitigate the risk for developers and, quite frankly, architects, speaking as an architecture firm, to the condo liability laws and how we can make it so that we kind of rebalance that risk so that people can invest in these type of buildings and be able to turn them over to ownership to help more households get into the ownership model and to be able to buy into real estate.
And anyone else want to weigh in on that, Mott or David?
Yeah, I'd love to. Two quick points. I agree with everything. That Karen said. On the liability piece, this was actually the driving force behind Los Angeles' small lot subdivision ordinance, where we're getting very much into the weeds here, but there are common interest subdivisions where all the owners in a place share ownership of something, whether it's the main building or it's the tennis courts or whatever it is. And then there are single family fee simple subdivisions where there really isn't common ownership. And LA's small lot subdivision ordinance provides for the latter, single family subdivisions, fee simple at density. And I can tell you our insurance costs, our liability insurance costs, had we done condos, would have been about $30,000 to $40,000 a unit. This is back in 2000, 2006, 2007. Because we were able to do fee simple subdivision where everybody owned their own little piece, it went down to less than $5,000 a unit, which was huge. The other piece of subdivision law that's very important is well, it's not really the law; it's how we manage it as regulators. Today, no matter what size subdivision you go in for in most cities, at the end of the 18-month process, you'll get a 30-page letter that says you have to improve these 18 parts of the public infrastructure to the satisfaction of some regulator in the city, which creates tons of uncertainty. Again, it biases our process towards larger projects that can manage that type of thing. And I think we really need, as cities, to have small project subdivision rules that don't treat a 10-unit subdivision like a 2,000-unit new growth subdivision.
That's an excellent point for people elected or appointed to be thinking about in terms of their own zoning code and building code with respect to their own jurisdictions, as well as at the state level. I think we have time for maybe one or two more, but we had multiple questions regarding especially those projects that are going to minimize or eliminate parking or have depend on access to other forms of transportation such as EVs. Do you have some comments on how you get EV infrastructure into these projects? And beyond that, do you build some form of bike parking in or alternatives for active transportation?
Yeah, I can jump in on all of that. I think you want to be, anybody that's building housing right now wants to be thinking about how you are providing electric access for vehicles, including bikes and electric vehicles. And so that's absolutely should be considered. That's part of just providing housing. As you get into larger units, making sure you have bike parking for all different size bikes, the long bikes with the kids on the back and the wider adult tricycles and charging for those. And so, yeah, absolutely. That should be part of all of these projects, especially when you are building them for multimodal jurisdictions. I wanted to say though about the other part of that is that this is also an important solution for cities that are looking to provide more mobility choices and to actually build more housing within their single family neighborhoods. This is a process. It took us 75 years to build ourselves into this problem, and it's going to take time to make our cities, to retrofit our cities to be more environmentally responsible and more fiscally responsible. Like our infrastructure issues, cities are needing to look at how to reduce their infrastructure costs and maintenance costs. And so it's you have to do both. Like you can provide the housing even as the infrastructure is being built, and you can be building infrastructure and allowing small commercial uses for small new neighborhood corner stores. We did a code in Cincinnati where we allowed any corner store that at any point in history had been a corner store could become a corner store again, to start to bring retail back in and then bring more housing back in. And so building missing middle housing, there are lots of families, you can build it anywhere, even without the walkable neighborhood, even if a neighborhood is transitioning toward that, because it is often a single teacher that's living in that. They only need one car, right? They're only ever going to need one car because these are single person households in some cases, right? So you can build housing as you're building the infrastructure, then build the infrastructure as you're building, supporting small local businesses. You have to kind of do all of it at once as we're gradually starting to transition our town over years. We're playing the long game here. How do we transition to more sustainable modes across the board? And so all of those things are really important to be considered and to think about as you're either regulating or as you're designing the projects.
Roger, may I chime in on that?
Go ahead, Mott.
Yeah, there's a tendency to think that when we build new projects or create new policies that we're reinventing the entire world. And the truth is that if a city adds more than 0.5% of its housing stock in any year, that's an excellent year for housing production. And today in metropolitan California, something like 2/3 of all renter households have less than 2 cars. And about 20% of renter households have no cars. And this is true even in Los Angeles. And so I don't think we're building for some abstract future that may or may not come if we build the infrastructure. We're building for people today who have, 90% of people who move don't do it because they're actually more than 90%. It's probably more like 90, 95, 96% of people who move are not displaced. They get a new job, they get married, they get divorced, and this is across the income spectrum. And we need to provide housing choice for people. And right now we are simply not building housing for that 20% of households that have no car, or frankly, for the 40-some percent that have only one car. So it's not about building for a new world, it's about building for this world right now.
Well, that's a point well taken, and I might just add in terms of the EV charging infrastructure. There's now significant money available from the state level to support the installation of EV infrastructure, and a couple of pieces of legislation that are going to direct a look at the regulations, and the building code with respect to EV charging infrastructure for both new and existing buildings. So we may see some advances coming from that direction as well. But I think any developer and any city or county that's working with a developer ought to be looking at the state for a potential source to help with getting that EV infrastructure put in a project at no at least additional cost to the developer and to the ultimate consumer. I think we probably have run out of time. We have lots of good questions. We'll capture those. We are recording this session for all of you, so we'll make that available. Let me take just a moment in closing to thank Karen, David, and Mott for their excellent presentations, and I appreciate the comments in the chat, also recognizing the very, very high quality of the presentation. You've also given us a lot to think about, and I think any of us in jurisdictions around the state can do a lot of work to try and incentivize and make it possible to develop more middle missing housing. Let me say, as our screen shows, our event is sponsored by Meta, and it is part of a virtual roundtable series that Civic Well is hosting. So we'll have some additional roundtables coming up in the months ahead, and we'd like to ask if you would consider filling out a survey that hopefully was just linked in the chat, and it's not a terribly long survey, but it helps us refine how we present these roundtables to make them attractive to the most people and meaningful to the most people possible. Finally, please look for a recording of the event that I just mentioned we're doing now, coming to your inbox, along with information about how you can become a member of Civic Well and thereby receive additional resources exclusive to our membership. We very much appreciate not just our presenters, but those of you who have joined us as the audience this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. So wherever you are, have a great, happy and safe evening and weekend ahead. Thanks again, and good evening.